Item number 80, ordinance 19-18, amending chapter 6.03.1 of the city charter pertaining to the imposition of civil penalties for violations of city ordinances.
And I believe we will get a staff report from Ms. Scarda and Director Cervantes. Welcome.
Thank you, Council President Brennan, members of council, Teresa Scarda. I'm just going to cover some of the general items, and Director Cervantes will get into a little more detail. The amendment before you proposes to amend the city's charter to allow the city to create a process to issue civil penalties for violations of city ordinance. As it states, it would give council the authority to establish, enforce, alter, or repeal a procedure by ordinance to impose civil penalties. Passing this amendment does not mean that the departments can begin issuing civil penalties. The language only allows the city to begin work on language that would define how civil penalties work. Any ordinance language would be brought before the council for review and approval. The council would also need to review and approve any ordinance amendments related to how much violations of city code would be for an appropriate civil penalty, how much that penalty would cost the individual, and even the appeals process for kind of how this would operate. Each ordinance change, just like today, would require a public hearing. This is just another tool in our toolbox. It's used in many other cities, Bloomington, Minneapolis, and St. Cloud, to name a few.
Thank you.
Council President Brenmoen, council members, Ricardo Cervantes, Director to the Department of Safety and Inspections, and I just want to speak to why it's important for DSI. I think it's important for the city, but specifically for DSI. And so what we're hoping to achieve is, we desire to create a more effective compliance tool. We also want to create a tool where tools don't currently exist in the spectrum of enforcement in our various divisions in DSI. We want to avoid unintended consequences. We want to save time in the process, so we're always looking for ways that we can be more efficient and more effective. And then gain process consistency between all of our divisions. And we would see using this tool to, again, use it where we don't have an effective tool, but then also to augment the other tools that are available to us. And in DSI, we have a variety of different tools that we use to gain compliance. Specifically, some of the benefits would be to decriminalize relatively minor violations. So currently, DSI issues on average about 100 criminal citations annually. And so this tool would help us gain compliance without using that, what I would say is a more severe tool. It would also reduce residents being displaced, where they're living in certificate of occupancy buildings. That is a tool that we have used, is very effective. We're using it more sparingly, but it's an effective tool to get landlords who are not, moving quick enough, is to threaten a revocation of their certificate of occupancy. That's disruptive for tenants and sometimes could result in the displacement of tenants. Again, we're looking to streamline the process and have a customer-focused appeal process, a forum by which people could come in and create the due process as we create the new language, where they can come in and have their day in court to be heard, and in a more casual setting, so that you need not lawyer up in order to plead your case. And then also is just to increase the effectiveness through this efficient tool. Like I said, we have a variety of other tools. We've been asked, will you keep those tools? Today, we're only asking you to consider voting on the enabling language, which will allow for us to develop that language. And then again, we'll be very inclusive in regards to including our stakeholders in the various realms where we'll be using this tool. The BRC has already been made aware of our proposal on this tool. We've reached out to the district councils. There's many other stakeholders in the various realms in which we exist.
Would you give an example of where we currently give a criminal citation and something that would be lessened by having this administrative citation?
Sure. So animal control issues the majority of our criminal citations. We just had a case about 3 weeks ago where a criminal citation was issued and there was a notice to appear. An individual didn't appear, and so a bench warrant was issued for that individual. They appeared to the second hearing. After the second hearing, we advised him that there was a bench warrant, that he should take care of that. He went to go pay the fine and was actually incarcerated for about 4 hours, paid his fine, and then was later released. So we could avoid that by using an administrative citation. We can avoid, when people do receive criminal citations and they're found guilty, they then have a criminal record. Even though they may be reduced to a lesser degree, petty misdemeanor, it'll still show up in the record and may impact employment opportunities, rental opportunities, and other opportunities.
And I was just checking with Ms. Tierney, so we're talking about a misdemeanor for an animal control issue.
Correct.
Which may sometimes be the appropriate measure, but it sounds like in this case, this poor guy. Okay, so because sometimes it's like, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? And I know there's other examples where we use excessive consumption and it isn't an effective tool because it doesn't escalate. It just stays at a very manageable level. And sometimes it equates to a cost of doing business. But I hadn't heard of the misdemeanor side of this where animal control, where this is a way that we can lessen our impact when we deal with enforcement. Ms. Naker.
Just if I might on that point, I strongly support this move to having an additional tool in the toolbox, and one of the uses that I see for it in my ward is in downtown St. Paul, where right now if we have a building that is out of compliance with our code, we have either very, very minimal, $400 fines that we can levy that basically just cover the cost of DSI's work to do the enforcement, or we can pull in the property manager on criminal charges. For, say, a roof that's been leaking for 20 years, which doesn't seem like the right course of action to take against the individual who's managing the property, but it's the only other tool we have to correct some of these serious deficiencies. So that's just another example to that point.
Thank you. Ms. Nelson.
I forgot my question, so I'll get back to you.
It'll come back. Are there other questions for Mr. Cervantes? And I know this has been something that we've been muddling around for a long time, and again, you mentioned this is really just enabling language, and so nothing really changes should this pass, except that we're able to start working on some of these ordinances and making administrative enforcement changes to them, citation and changes to them. So those would be brought before us again, and each of them would be considered separately. Okay, no other questions? All right, stand by. This is a public hearing. Is there anyone here who would like to speak to this item? If you'd like to speak to the item, why don't you just come on up? If there's more than one person, it helps a little bit because we have 15 minutes. I know how to help keep things moving along. So looks like there's about 4 people. Is that right? 4? Okay, wonderful. Why don't you come up and introduce yourself, let us know where you live, and then remember to sign in when you're done. And I'll just, since there's 4 of you, it's about 3.5, 4 minutes each. So I'll just kind of remind you like where we're at with time.
I have 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Will that do?
That'll be perfect. You win an award if you do that. Welcome.
President Brenmone and council members, thank you for the opportunity to speak about proposed ordinance 19-18. My name is Grace Schmidt. I've lived in St. Paul for nearly 40 years, and my husband was born and raised on the west side. We currently live in Ward 7 at 1172 South Winthrop Street. Zip is 55119. I'm here to request that you not adopt proposed ordinance 1918 in its current state. First, there is an existing section in the city's legislative code, section 1.02 of part 2. I want you to know I've been doing my reading, entitled penalty. It defines specific consequences for any person violating any provision of the legislative code. In the existing language, it is the judiciary branch of our government that levies a fine or civil penalty if a person is found guilty of the violation. I do not yet fully understand, or maybe I don't accept, the reasons why a new amendment is needed, giving the city council full power and authority to impose civil penalties, when the current language rightly places the authority for imposing civil penalties with our judicial system. Excuse me. In a transcription of the Charter Commission's February 11th meeting, a city staff member is quoted as saying, "It is a laborious process to charge someone with a misdemeanor offense. The burden of proof is very high," end quote. As well it should be. We have a due process in our government for a reason. Secondly, where and how will the new power and authority to impose civil penalties be used and implemented? Who will, in fact, decide which ordinances are selected and what constitutes appropriate violations? As they say, the devil is in the details. At first, I was told the amendment is for the Department of Public Safety and Inspections and would be used only by them. Then I read that the Charter Commission was told it's pretty wide open where this tool could be used. Which departments are waiting in the wings for the charter to be amended so that administrative citations and escalating fines can be used to enforce existing ordinances? I understand that DSI, the Department of Safety and Inspections, has projected $250,000 in new revenue through the use of administrative citations and civil penalties. Let's get the details published and out in the open before the charter is amended. Let's get deeper understanding of how this would really work. I've learned the city's legislative codes contains well over 200 chapters. With the current broad language proposed, it seems to me that you have a blank check, which respectfully at this point, I cannot endorse. Finally, it was explained to me earlier today that the St. Paul's City Charter is really our Constitution. It's an apt analogy and is all the more reason to move slowly with great care and deep understanding of the implications of this proposed constitutional amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcia. And time does seem to go faster when you're up there, because that was 3.5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
It's amazing. It happens to everybody. The timer didn't go off, so I overrode it up here. So you can go ahead.
Hello, council member. My name is Colleen Halpine, and I live at 110 Virginia Street in St. Paul. And I'm here to request that you vote no also on this charter amendment. I think it needs much more review by the public, so I'm asking that you vote no. The strong language of the proposed change to the city charter states, "The council shall have the full power and authority to impose civil penalties for each violation of any city ordinance." This is a change to the city government which needs more scrutiny by the citizens. Why is this needed? Were there studies to show that this would be fair? What are the advantages to the citizens with this change? These are the sort of things that I have not seen really publicly discussed. The charter change expands the power to amend any ordinance. It isn't just to the Department of Safety and Inspections. It appears that Ordinance 1918 paves the way for the city to be abusive with their fining abilities. We don't want St. Paul to be following the footsteps of a town like Ferguson, Missouri, where the city council, they were using fines to fund major parts of the city budget. It's a very unfair system which preys on the poor, who, if they can't pay their fine on time, are threatened with late fees and even with jail time. In one case that I heard of, a Ferguson, Missouri resident was put in jail because her garbage can lid was not on tight enough. And she ended up in jail for 3 days because she could not pay a $25 fine. I'm suspicious that the city may use escalating fines and aggressive tactics to demand payment for late garbage bills as a way to further punish people who are not paying their garbage bills for one reason or another. The citizens have tried to get the city council to understand how infuriating the garbage system is, and between the high fees, the bad service, billing problems, and the garbage haulers selling out to one another, the service is so poor, and the garbage haulers have very little incentive to improve their service. They have a 5-year contract. Only one council member voting no puts this ordinance on the ballot for the citizens to decide. By voting against this ordinance on the 24th, you'll be showing your constituents that you are in favor of more citizen input and more transparency in decision-making. Regardless of the council's actions, citizens are ready to pursue a petition process to make sure that this charter change is on the ballot. In fact, signatures are already being collected. Only 2,500 signatures are needed, and this is less than half of what was needed for the garbage referendum. I request that you vote no and show that this time you are listening to the citizens. And I also would like to submit a statement by Bruce Clark, so I give it to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. The two of you have about 8 minutes to share. Welcome.
Well,
You don't need to adjust the mics. If you just stand right between them, they'll pick you up great.
All right. My name is Patricia Hartman, and I'm here also to urge that at least one of the council members vote no and stop this. Just to add to some of the earlier remarks with which I totally agree, I think when you're treading in the area of penalties and fines, punishments for the citizenry, prudence would dictate that you do so cautiously. The law does not favor imposing penalties lightly, and the issue of transparency is huge in this one. The examples that are being painted for us are that we should decriminalize things and perhaps notch down the penalties. But that isn't really what this kind of a change is going to limit you to. If you think you only need a fly swatter, don't arm yourselves with a baseball bat. And this is a weapon for mass destruction, and it should be very cautiously assumed. I think that we hopefully have learned something from this garbage situation that we've all been dealing with. And that is, it would have been smart to roll something out on a pilot basis. If there's a specific situation that you think needs penalty amendment, address it within the context of that and let people know concretely what the problem is and what the change in penalties would be that you propose. Yes, we are currently gathering petition signatures on this one, but we're hoping that we don't need to go that route because you 7 members, each and every one of you has the power to avoid us from this kind of work. As you know, charter amendments are serious business. Generally, a charter is set forth and amended by the electorate on a ballot. And that procedure was in the same statute that you've gone to. And it's everything from the substance of this amendment to the procedure that you've chosen. It looks as though the Charter Commission has asked you to do this because that's what the statute says. But we all know you asked the Charter Commission to ask you to make this change. You speak in terms of efficiency. It's not clear to me what the hurry is here. And in that regard, I would like to point out that this same body did vote 6 months ago today that they were going to repeal Ordinance 1840, another trash ordinance, and we have yet to see the repealing ordinance that I believe the city attorney's office was supposed to draft. And I would just like to point that out. I think there's some unfinished business that would take precedence over this. And we have the city attorney here today, correct? Yes. I would like to give you a copy of a letter I sent yesterday to your office. I have it. Oh, you got it? Thank you.
Thank you. And welcome.
Good evening. So my name is Shannon Watson. I am a St. Paul resident. I do live at 1180 Van Buren, but I am here for expediency's sake, representing a whole lot of people. I am wearing two hats. I am the Director of Public Affairs for the St. Paul Area Chamber, and I am also the Chair of the City of St. Paul Business Review Council. Rules without penalties are basically suggestions. So this proposal would give the department the ability to better enforce the law. Having only criminal citations as an enforcement tool for infractions is not reasonable. Administrative citations and fines are a much more responsible way to start the penalty process for violations. Both the Chamber and the BRC support the creation of administrative citations as a way for the city to address problems with a proportionate response. Neither of those groups has expressed any concern about the impact on law-abiding members of our community, as the vast majority of businesses and property owners in the city of St. Paul play by the rules and will not be affected by this change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to speak on this matter? All right, seeing none, Ms. Naker moves to close the public hearing. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion prevails.
7 in favor, no one opposed. The public hearing is closed and the ordinance is laid over to April 24th for final adoption.
And we're just going to hold on for one moment. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we don't vote on these things tonight. So if there's a few council members who have something they'd like to add, and because there are people here this evening, and typically on our fourth vote, there's not. So Ms. Naker.
Thank you for that opportunity. I do want to thank the folks who were able to come down tonight. And I want to let you know that I do hear you and agree with your points about the need for caution and the need to ensure due process and to ensure fairness. I've heard from people here tonight. I've heard from constituents by email beforehand. And I agree with those points. I also agree with the point that was made that the devil is in the details. And from my perspective, what we're doing tonight, or actually what we'll do next week, is just voting on whether or not we give ourselves the ability to delve into those details by passing an ordinance that will lay out how this will be a fair, cautious due process for all involved. So I think we owe ourselves the right to delve into those details, and that will be a public, transparent process as we do so. I do think we need another tool in our toolbox, because there is nothing more frustrating than sitting at this table and spending the amount of time and effort and thought that we all do to create ordinances and then feel as though our hands are tied because we don't have the power in place to enforce them. So I'm very supportive of this tool, but I do think that there are ways to make sure that we use it fairly.
Ms. Nelson?
I want to appreciate everyone who came to share their perspective with us on this tonight. I think that there's a few things that are important to point out. And the first is that everyone in our society has rights under the law that can't be contravened or overridden by the actions that we take. And we are accountable to the law, as everyone is, for what we do. That is just, there's been a lot of discussion about this as sort of violating what people's legal rights and, due process avenues are, and this is just, there's no way that this isn't also accountable to that. Right now, the only options we have are to charge people with local crimes or to do nothing. Those are the options that we have. And to echo what Councilmember Naker said, the vote we are taking tonight is to say, we believe the people of our community deserve other alternatives and means to resolve things that are about following our city's zoning codes, making sure properties are in good condition, making sure that tenants are not displaced by terrible property managers who we have so few means to hold accountable. So to me, what we stand to gain by voting to have a very comprehensive process with stakeholder discussions, with community input, with checks down the road and multiple votes to make sure that everything is in order is more than worth it to move beyond the normal we have now. So I will be supporting tonight's motion. I think that people with individual legal questions can, I'm sure, speak to our city attorney's office and other folks, but I want to make sure people understand the reality we have right now and how we do need to move beyond that. It's not good for our community.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Ms. Prince?
I appreciate that a lot of work has been done on this to date. I am really late coming to this. I have not yet had a meeting with staff, and that may just be because our schedules haven't lined up. But I I find the arguments about an additional tool in the toolbox to be very compelling. I think there are areas in which, for example, one tool that we have, as opposed to a criminal citation, is that if someone who holds a C of O violates it, we can revoke the C of O. And one thing I appreciate about the discussion we're having with administrative citations is if we revoke that C of O, we automatically have to vacate that property. This would give us the option of imposing a penalty without vacating the building in that case. So I do believe that there is a way for us to use an administrative citation that will actually make the city's work kinder and gentler. So I'm really open to it that way, but I'm also really moved by the arguments that I heard tonight about the way this is kind of coming up so quickly and with a feeling that we haven't done an extensive process on it. And I don't know if it's reasonable for us to say, well, don't worry about changing the charter, because when it comes to doing the ordinances, we'll do it really reasonably and fairly with a lot of public process. I am going to struggle with this over the next week, and I'm also planning to meet with staff, but I do feel this is a constitutional change. We're looking at a number of them tonight, and maybe it's just the coincidence of having them all come forward together, but it's going to be hard for me to take several votes next week or in the next few weeks if we decide to delay any of them about changing our Constitution. So I have not closed my mind to the charter change, but I do feel, if I don't feel like I've been part of the discussion to date, then I really understand members of the community, and including constituents of mine who reached out to me with questions about the impact of this charter change that I could not answer because I have not been part of this discussion to date. So it's happening quickly. I think I appreciate that people who have been part of the who are activated by the garbage hauling controversy are saying to us, take a minute and think about what you're doing, because I think all of us to some extent feel that we moved quickly on that, and it ended up with a lot of unintended consequences that we are now trying to change. So I guess I'll just say for the time being that I'm not ready to vote in support of this charter change, and that could change in the next week or two if and when I get some additional information.
Mr. Tolbert.
I just have a question for Ms. Tierney. So just because based on some of the conversation that we're having at the table, just so I'm clear, what we would vote on here gives the council the authority to create an ordinance that allows these administrative fines or penalties to go forward. It doesn't put it in, and that would need to go through an ordinance process, so we could either use it or not use it, create it, would have the 4 readings, including a public hearing, and delete it if we find it in violation. This is just giving us the authority to do that, because at this moment, we don't have the authority to do that if we wanted to.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Mr. Tao.
Thank you, Council President. I have a question for Mr. Ricardo before I make my comment. Director Savante, can you give us is there any statistic on who are most impacted by when we when we criminalize them, and have you had any other story that we could help shape their life and instead of criminalizing them?
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Tao. I don't have all the statistics with me. I had mentioned that we average about 100 criminal citations annually. I know that the majorities those are being generated by our animal control folks, but we also issued those as they relate to construction projects, fire certificate of occupancy cases, and others. But I would say the makeup of that population is mixed. So when we look at the animal control numbers around criminal citations, that's a wide spectrum of individuals, folks with means and many folks without means. So folks who love animals and folks who don't care for animals the way that our ordinances prescribe. In regards to, how are they impacted by the criminal citation, there will be a permanent record if they're found guilty. I had mentioned that many of those cases may not result in a misdemeanor charge, but a petty misdemeanor. And although that may not technically be criminal, that impacts them in ways of application. So if they're applying for credit or if they're applying for a rental unit and somebody's doing a criminal background, if they're applying for a job at Target, they're going to do a criminal background. And if they see that there is blemishes on their record, they're less likely to be chosen, either for a job or as a tenant, when there are other applicants that don't have that blemish on their record. So they're negatively impacted by that.
Thank you for that. And then my other question was, given what you heard from the resident who came down here to testify, they're talking about transparency. Can you share with us what your vision might be like and how inclusive this would be and how transparent this process would be?
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Tao, the way that we've engaged our stakeholders in the past around ordinances is we want to be very thoughtful of the impacts that we believe that those folks that are going to be either receiving citations or be around individuals that are going to be receiving citations would be included in this. As I had mentioned, we've reached out to the district council already, and we would be including them in our discussion to help us gain the residential perspective. We've reached out to the BRC. We have other business entities which may be impacted, and we would include, those business associations, the SABA and others in these discussions. We would also, look for other avenues to have conversations and include input from individuals that may be impacted by this or have concerns, even if they may not directly be impacted, but also would have legal concerns or other concerns, so that we could address those openly, transparently, before we bring any recommendations to council.
Does that mean that how would the resident that came down here to testify, how can they be a part of this process? Are you open to them being part of this process?
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Tao, absolutely. We would make notice that we're going to be having meetings in the community, when and what the topic is, and we'd be reviewing what our thoughts are in draft language, and we would be sharing that and taking input on that.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
I hear the concern of the resident that came down here too, and I think this speak clearly our commitment to transparency. I think some of the folks that live in my Ward 1, are low-income folks who fixed income, people of color who, if we criminalize them, it would cost them more. It would be a hardship for their family and for themselves. And so I think this is another way that we can get to what we want, and working with our resident who might be in citation, but this wouldn't criminalize them. And so I think this is a smart move. And I think that it's just like what we said here is just this gives us the ability to create that process. And so we won't vote tonight, but I'll be in support of it.
Thank you. Other thoughts? And as we were talking tonight, I was remembering I had a conversation with Ms. Prince when we were discussing the requirement for landlords to let renters know about voter registration. And one of the concerns you had was that the penalty was a misdemeanor, but that was the only tool we had to use for enforcement. And I think it was an inappropriate tool, but it's a tool we had. So when I think about that particular piece of legislation, I think it would have been better if there was something more appropriate, like an administrative citation attached to it as opposed to a criminal citation. And it popped into my mind as we were talking about it. I'm supportive as well. I know we've done a lot of work on this. It seems like you'll have a busy week, Ms. Brents. And we did vote to close the public hearing and the matter is laid over.
Item number 81, ordinance